Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 33 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Thanks for listening. This week we're talking with the host of The Franchise, a great podcast breaking down Hollywood's passion for sequels, the good, the bad, and the oh-so-ugly. It's my current podcast obsession. But before that chat, I wanted to cheer on the director of a very bad new movie called Blind. It's out on VOD right now, and it stars Alec Baldwin. He plays a college professor and novelist who is blind, who is romancing a woman who is already in a committed relationship, but her partner is a pretty bad dude. He's played by Dylan McDermott, and she is Demi Moore. Haven't seen her in such a big role in quite some time. Now, why would I want to cheer on a terrible new movie? Well, check out what the director said following the latest blast of PC insanity. An advocacy group for the blind is really mad the film chose a cited celebrity like Alec Baldwin to play the role. They should have casted a person who is blind to play the blind character. Well, director Michael Mailer, son of Norman Mailer, fought back with a very public letter, and I have to say, you have to go find it online. I found it at deadline.com, but you'll be seeing it elsewhere online soon enough. But you need to read the whole letter in its entirety. But I wanted to read just one little snippet of it because I think it really speaks to not just this issue, but other freedom of speech issues that are coming to the fore right now. And I'm so glad he said it, but I think more people need to say it. Here's Mailer's comments on the situation. He says the argument also speaks to the larger forces governing political correctness, which have become so poisonous as to ossify any helpful and progressive cultural discourse. If political correctness can be used as a cudgel to attack the very freedoms of expression the United States so cherishes, how can such a notion protect against the clear and present countervailing forces of brutishness that succeed in destroying advances in human rights? My father, Norman Mailer, an active voice against the fascistic tendencies present in America's oft-fragile democracy, wrote many novels set in lands to which he had no physical or hereditary relationship. Because he was not Egyptian or German by birth, did he have no business writing about ancient Egypt in Hitler's youth? Art and political correctness rarely mix, and that's kind of the point. But when the requirement to be PC stifles freedom of expression, a line has been crossed. Well, bravo, Mr. Mailer, you're right on. Maybe he'll make a better movie next time. Sounds like he's a pretty good writer as is, but let's see if that translates to the big screen. But more importantly, maybe he'll convince some of the cowardly peers in Hollywood to take a similar stand against these PC bullies. It's about time.
You're listening to my daddy's podcast. He thinks blueberry muffins are a fruit.
Thanks, Eli. This week's HiT tip of the week is their finest, an old-school romance and drama in the best sense of the word. The film follows a British movie makers charged with creating propaganda to keep spirits high in the early days of World War II. Germany was on the march, the United States was not in the war as of yet, and the British people were taking a pounding literally with bombing raids from the Nazi forces. Gemma Arterton stars as an unlikely screenwriter tasked with bringing a woman's touch to these features. The film's feminism is actually gently observed and smart, but Bill Nighy really steals the movie. He plays a vain actor who shows surprising depth as the movie goes on, and especially as the bombing raids draw closer and closer to the people showcased in the movie. This is really smart storytelling, but the thing that really stood out to me, the tiny details in scene after scene after scene. That's what makes good storytelling pop off the screen. Their Finest is brand new on Blu-ray and home video, and I highly recommend it.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
All right, let's get to this week's interview with The Franchise's Daniel Ehrenberg and Henry Papali. The weekly podcast reviews films that are part of a Hollywood franchise. Think that original Rocky all the way through Creed, the Friday the 13th saga, In Toto, and even those Dirty Dancing movies in the recent reboot. That was brutal. It's kind of fun to listen to the guys deconstruct that one in the worst way possible. The hosts have killer chemistry. They're friends off screen, or I guess off mic, to be more exact. And they aren't snobs by any stretch. Yeah, they know their movies. Yes, they love their movies, but they love good movies, junky movies for all the right reasons. And best of all, they do plenty of homework before each show. And you can tell by everything they say. Here's my chat with the franchise's hosts, Daniel Ehrenberg and Henry Papali. Well, thanks for joining the show, Daniel and Henry. You guys have about a year plus of a franchise podcast under your belt now. What are some of the bigger takeaways about the experience? This is, kind of the maiden voyage. What kind of jumps out at you about the first year?
Why don't you go ahead, Daniel?
All right, this is Daniel. The first year has been sort of what I expected. I wanted to do this podcast because I had it in my head from watching Friday the 13th in its entirety that anything can be a franchise, and anything these days should be a franchise. That's what the studios want. So Friday the 13th was particularly amazing to me because they made one a year for such a long time, and they seemingly never planned ahead. Like, they got the movie out there, and they, it was a hit. And then the next year, oh, shoot, I guess we have to do another one. You'd think they'd learn after the first, 6 or 7. But they never did. And it's the reverse now, because everything is supposed to be a franchise. So they come up with the sequel before they have any inkling that the first one's going to be successful, which is why you have high-profile flops now like The Mummy, which was supposed to launch an entire universe, and why you have franchises like Transformers that develop an entire writer's room in the way television shows have for, since the inception of television. And, they're testing the waters with, hey, they went to see 5 Transformers movies. How about a spin-off of one of these cars?
By the way, can you put writer's room in scare quotes referring to the Transformers, please? That'd be helpful.
Oh, I know. You hated the last night, didn't you? I saw that. That was the harshest I've ever seen you, Christian.
I got my gander up.
Mm.
Well, one of the things that I've done over the years, and I remember I used to work with a film critic, and he would stamp every movie 1.5 stars. I mean, this is like Oscar bait films, 1.5 stars. And I never wanted to be that guy, but I do notice that when I go to the screenings now, I look at the running time, and unless it's got Spider-Man or the Hulk in it, I want it to be as short as possible. Do you guys find that you're getting a little more cynical as you watch all these movies, especially the bad ones back to back, or is it still kind of the love of movies is still kind of strong and as good as ever?
I'm Henry. Should I take this one, Dan?
Well, I'll say just really quickly, I couldn't agree with you more on running times, which is why lately I've been catching up with the films of Joe Swanberg. Last night I watched Happy Christmas, which was 82 minutes, and it was delightful. Just because I am exhausted. At one point, my Netflix queue, and I don't go to theaters anymore, so it's all recent movies. My Netflix queue was up to 27 movies, and there was nothing on there under 2 hours and 12 minutes.
Well, I have to ask before we get to Henry, why not going to the movies? What's the? I guess there's a million reasons why, but I'm just kind of curious.
I take no pleasure in the experience. I don't drink anymore, so the theaters that serve booze are not interesting to me. And in normal theaters, there's always going to be some maniac yapping through it. And frankly, I have a television that's 60 inches. If the movie doesn't work on my television, the movie doesn't work.
Yeah, good point. Have you kept your love of movies, Henry? Or are you getting a little more cynical like myself?
No, man. I have definitely kept my love of movies. I mean, I was going to bring up, before Daniel did, I was going to say for him, I know he's definitely got a thing about the 90-minute mark or under, and I was sort of always the opposite. I always loved big, long, Kubrickian 3-hour epics, but the funny thing about doing the show is that ever since we do the show, we generally, on average, have to watch 2 movies a week. So there's sort of an involuntary reflex I have now where I am absolutely thrilled when there is a movie that is 90 minutes or shorter, or even under 2 hours. Because there's been some that we've had to really slog through. And but no, more than 2 hours long?
Yeah.
How long was Dirty Dancing?
Dirty Dancing was relatively short.
That was fine. No, I got one. Batman versus Superman. I mean, that's...
Excuse me, Henry.
Sorry. Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice.
Thank you.
You know, I mean, and there's several that are like over 2 hours, but in answer to the question, has it made me more cynical? I mean, that's kind of like a yes and no. Like, it's such a hilarious endeavor to watch some of this junk that we watch, but also it's brought me back to some stuff that I've just loved even more. And I do go to the theater, and I agree with Dan that a lot of the time, and I'm not interested really anymore in any of the communal experience or any of that stuff, but I do like seeing stuff on the very, very, very large screen. I do not have a 60-inch television like Dan. So it's nice, but I totally understand his point, because there's usually, you know, if it's a crowded theater, it's a pain. I mean, there's always some jerk, you know, pontificating or just being an idiot. So it is tough, but I do go a lot. So
you guys already mentioned the fact that sequels and franchises are just built into the system, and even when they're bad movies, it's meant to launch a franchise. What else have you noticed about Hollywood or films that maybe you wouldn't have kind of checked out a year before the show began? Like, what's other trends, more subtle things, anything like that kind of jumps to mind about that you, because you're seeing so many films back to back, you're kind of noticing now more than ever?
There are no mid-budget movies. They don't exist anymore. And it's been really amazing, because a lot of the better franchises that we've covered from the 70s through the 90s were built on relatively low-budget films.
That's right.
You know, they become surprise hits, and you can't have a surprise hit if you need all of your movies to be giant hits.
Yeah.
The budgets are far too high now. To the point where you get something. We just covered Independence Day, and Independence Day Resurgence made $340 million at the box office, and it's considered a flop. That's a problem.
Anything else you've noticed, Henry, on that front? Sort of just trends that are just...
Well, I don't know about trends, but getting back a little bit to what you were saying in the earlier part of the question, things that I've noticed trend-wise, just in terms of the breadth of stuff that we've covered. One thing that I never realized was I can't think of like a better word, but sort of the incestuous nature of Hollywood. Like, we often come across so many movies where we'll be like, oh, that's the same editor who was in, you know, Jaws. That's the cinematographer who did Rocky 2 and 3, and he also shot Jaws. And then, you know, like, there's all this cross-pollination that I don't think I was quite aware of to the extent. And sometimes it's nice, because it seems almost like in a certain era it was more of like a community where people stuck together and used the same people. But
now you see that on a smaller level, Hank, because
Right.
if you watch enough television, or even in the podcast community, you can see comedians permeating other shows. There are I watch this show called Playing House on TBS, and every actor that's on that show I've heard on a podcast somewhere.
Yeah.
In the first year or so, I remember you guys broke my collective heart with your Superman trashing. What movie was sort of the biggest sort of shock to you that it just didn't hold up, or maybe it was actually maturing quite gracefully? More to your surprise.
Good question. So the best and the worst, essentially?
Just anything that comes to mind that was really a shock to you guys.
Superman is still the worst, I think. Not the worst movie we've covered by any stretch of the imagination, just the one that bummed me out the hardest. Because, I, like many people, have thought of that movie as this epic brilliant classic for so many years. And it's a problematic, weird, overstuffed movie with, bad villains. And I mean, part of the problem is also the fact that there are so many superhero movies now. And I think Marvel Studios and people like Christopher Nolan have nailed them so well that it's hard to go back and look at something like that. It seems almost quaint.
I think for me, I actually had our list in front of us just so I didn't forget anything of everything we've done. And looking at the list, I'm hard-pressed to disagree with Dan. I think Superman as well. Also for me, I was fully expecting to go into that movie completely applauding every aspect of it, and it absolutely was not what I remembered it to be. So that was very surprising to me.
And to a lesser extent, I would say The Matrix, which
not for me.
Many people can... Yeah, I know. Henry never loved that movie to the same degree I did, but for a movie that's widely considered one of the great films of all time, sci-fi or otherwise, I was surprised how of its time it felt.
Yeah, and I would say that for me, one of the movies that really was fantastic to revisit, and I think you can even get this when you listen to the episode, was the first Dirty Harry movie. That was surprising. I was expecting to like it because I had seen it several times, but it had been a very long time since I saw it. And I think when I watched it again, I was very surprised at the artistry of the movie. It's just so well done, and so that was the rest of them, of course, they vary in quality, but that first Dirty Harry was nice.
That being said, not to be overly negative, I've discovered movies through this podcast, too, that I'd never seen before. Henry insisted that we cover Fletch, and I always thought that was just another silly 80s comedy, and there was a lot more to it than that, and I loved that movie.
I remember, because we don't ever talk about what our opinions of the movies before we record, Chris, and I remember when we recorded and Dan loved it so much, I was so happy because I was just not expecting it, So.
Yes, Henry was chuffed.
It's nice when that happens.
You guys talked before about Dirty Harry. One of the things that you do, which I don't think a lot of podcasts, especially movie podcasts, get into, is film scores. It was a Lalo Schifrin from a Dirty Harry franchise.
That's right.
Yeah.
Talk a little about that aspect, because I think that's one of the more interesting components of what you do. And I know Henry has a musical background, but are you guys kind of on the same page? And you think that maybe audiences don't give enough credit to movie scores in general?
I just think audiences don't think about movie scores that much in general, unless, the movie has a really signature sting. I mean, it's why audiences love John Williams so much, because his stuff is so iconic. It overpowers the action, but I think it's almost more impressive when someone just scores a movie so perfectly that you don't even notice it unless you're thinking about it. Hank, you should speak. This is the Henry special.
Well, no. I mean, I agree with what Dan just said, but I agree. I think that when a score is more understated, it's always much more effective. And I just watched Desierto by Jonas Cuarón, and the score to that was fantastic, and it was just kind of one of those Sicario-like scores where there's just a lot of bass
tones.
Yeah, exactly, a lot of low bass tones and stuff like that. And you really probably wouldn't notice it, but it stuck out to me, and it just matched the images perfectly. And also, I think besides the score, I think Dan and me have fell into kind of this. We never discussed doing this, but we kind of just fell into this rhythm, and I give a lot of credit to Dan because he knew what he was doing when we started. I knew nothing, and we've kind of unofficially divided up the who takes what, right, Dan? It's almost like you almost always take the writers because you yourself are a writer and you know a lot about that. We almost kind of always split the director talk, and then I always tend to take the score, and sometimes I take the cinematography. Right?
Yeah, we've never talked about it, though. I just think it goes to our respective interests, and I think it's why we work as well as we do if, I could pat our own back as a team.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's right.
You guys both have pretty strong opinions, and I think you're often on the stage, but not always. What's been your worst sort of disagreement, and is it hard to kind of carry on? Do you hit stop on the recorder?
Never. I'm a big believer of never press stop on the recording, and it's why you can my older podcast, Surviving Survivor, you can literally hear us break up and end the podcast on one of the last episodes. It's some listeners said they couldn't get through it, but I think it's really cool that we have that documented. By far the worst ever was Superman Returns, right, Henry?
Absolutely. Yeah,
I hate when people when listeners go back and listen from the beginning and they comment on that episode. It bothers me that episode is even up, because we got into such a heated argument, and it's such a stupid movie to argue over.
By the way, we'll have links to obviously to the podcast, but also to specific episodes at hollywoodintoto.com/franchise. So you'll kind of get all the references there as well. One of the things that's great about the internet and podcasting is that you get feedback, and you get some cranky feedback, and you get some good ones too. What's been your sort of, I guess, the reaction from people who like the show? Is what they're saying about your show surprising you, and what do they kind of connect with that maybe takes you aback, or you just...
People like Henry more than I thought they would.
That's surprising.
No, I'm joking.
I'm surprised too. Yeah, I'm surprised too.
Yeah. The feedback has been enormously positive, which we appreciate. The only surprising stuff is when we pore over the movies so specifically that it's always surprising to me when someone points out something we didn't talk about that they wanted us to.
Yeah, in the Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice, somebody pointed out that we didn't mention the Martha scenario. Remember that?
I can't believe we didn't mention the Martha scenario, but it happens all the time.
Yeah,
I don't always bring it up, but every week someone says something that we didn't talk about in the episode. And it's because everyone watches movies a different way, and what's significant to some might not be significant to others.
Or they catch a superhero count that we missed.
Oh, Henry, you should... that was your thing, superhero count. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. If Chris wants me to expound briefly on that.
Well, just explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, when we started, I got the idea that I guess I had recently seen American Hustle again, Chris, and I had noticed that just out of nowhere in that movie, I was looking at Hawkeye, Batman, Mystique, Lois Lane, and who's the other one? I always forget the other one. There's one more in there. But
Rocket Raccoon.
There you go, Rocket Raccoon. And I just thought it was hilarious, and so then I just became a habit. I was watching movies and going, oh my God, this everybody in this movie was in a superhero movie at some time or another. So I figured when we did this show, I would look up, if I didn't recognize right away, I would look up the filmographies of all the main people, and it's been a really funny thing to do, and I think...
But it's taken over Henry's life, because if he misses one, then that's the first thing we hear about the next day.
And sometimes it takes quite a long time. I think I told Dan I spent 35 minutes looking up Raiders of the Lost Ark, because there were so many people in it to go through and look at all their careers. So, but it's fun. It's fun.
I'm gonna make up a silly scenario, but it's actually for a good cause, I hope. You guys are at maybe a bar or a coffee shop, and there's a Hollywood producer there. He's exhausted. He's been reading bad headlines about the box office grosses, and he's kind of wondering what's going on with Hollywood. What are we doing wrong? And you've got his ear, or her ear. What would you tell him about sort of making Hollywood product better in 2017? It may sound like an obvious question, but just given your background, given the show, given the feedback you get from fans of the show, what would you kind of nudge him to do, or to kind of push, or to kind of change what they're up to in Hollywood?
Go for it.
You get a lot of young filmmakers that make a really low budget movie and then get the trust from the studios to do a franchise picture. So you have people like Gareth Edwards or John Watts, right, making these big movies. And what I would say is, instead of hiring them to do your franchise, if you like them enough and you want to give them all this money to do a movie, let them come up with something.
Yeah.
Give them $50 million to do their own idea rather than $200 million to do Jurassic World 2. Hey, Jeff Goldblum's back.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
And they'd be chomping at the bit to do just that too. So,
Yeah.
Henry, any thoughts along those lines?
I have a pretty generic thought, but just because it's something that I think about a lot, it hasn't really changed. It's a really generic thing, but it's just I really go to so many movies, watch so many movies, just like Dan. Well, not the going to movie part, but and so much. I get so mad at the studios for what you can tell is just total interference, and that still bothers me. And it can sound, I don't mean to pontificate or sound pretentious, but sometimes it's so refreshing to watch a movie like, The Lobster, and you can tell that nobody messed with this guy and what he was doing. They just let him make the movie, and that frustrates me a lot. And I guess that happens more with the bigger pictures, but I wish if I had a studio exec, I would say if you'd stop doing that, you might make a little bit more money, because you're basically getting talentless people to make decisions they shouldn't make.
It's basically what Jason Blum and Megan Ellison are doing on smaller levels. They're hiring talented people to make movies that they want to make, and that should be really all there is to it.
Yeah.
It's just that the stakes are so high because of the budgets and the IP involved.
There should be a dozen Jason Blums in Hollywood, and there's not. That's a mystery for another day. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Looking ahead to your show, year 2, you're kind of in there. Any changes? Any sort of structural changes? Different people coming in, or if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
Well, we definitely are going to have some new people on the show, for sure. We haven't really talked too much about changing the format. It seems to work. We will be having in the next few months an original theme song, so that'll be exciting.
I want to branch out and do odder franchises, because there are so many, and we've gained a really positive, solid following, but we've recently done really big movies like Jaws and Indiana Jones and Alien and Independence Day.
Right.
And when I first conceived of this podcast, I thought we should do, really sort of oddities. Mm-hmm. And it's why we're following up Indiana Jones with Hard Body.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
One of many reasons.
Which I can't wait to do. So I hope we do things like that going forward. I really want to... I'm fascinated by Tyler Perry. I've watched almost everything he's ever done. Henry won't let me do Medea because it's too long, but I think we're going to do Why Did I Get Married soon. There's things like Resident Evil, which is a series that never does that well domestically, but is always gigantic overseas. I want to explore that. So I think my hope going forward is we'll do fewer sort of classics and we'll branch out more.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And before I let both of you guys go, at the Hollywood and Total podcast, we always ask our guests what they're watching these days. And I know you guys have a huge lineup or stack of stuff you're watching, but maybe a little bit off the beaten path that you're enjoying that you could recommend.
Hank?
Well, I just finished the Ken Burns' The Roosevelts documentary on PBS. I recommend that. That's fantastic. And also, I saw an Iranian horror film recently called Under the Shadow, which I think a lot of people may have heard of, and I thought that was excellent. And I just find a lot of gems on Netflix streaming. I think and I saw a great documentary about Stanley Kubrick called S is for Stanley, which was fantastic. Dan?
Joe Swanberg, I've been digging into. I have the entirety of the Defiant Ones documentary about Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre on my DVR, which I'm anxious to finish. I watch a lot of television. That's my main thing. And right now I'm watching the Big Brother live feeds, which I'm enjoying. And I also Encino Man is on Hulu now, and I watched that twice last week. So that's how my life is going.
Oh my god!
I'll leave you with one which I simultaneously hated and loved. It's called The Greasy Strangler. It's not a franchise, but it's the oddest movie I've seen in maybe 20 years.
I've heard about it. It was at South by last year. I heard a lot of good things.
It's growing on my brain like a weed. Well, guys, thank you so much. Now, this is a great podcast, The Franchise. It's my favorite show that doesn't involve the name Corolla in it in any capacity. Really good content. I've known Henry for a while, and just check the show out. I'll have a lot of show notes, information there to see, and wish you guys all the best. Thanks again, and we will check in with you soon.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And you can hear Chris Toto on our Austin Powers episode.
That's right.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.